Stormur. Þá næstur á mælendaskrá Jeffrey Guarino. Hann var bandaríkjamaður búsettur á Íslandi og var einn af þeim sem fluttu ræðu á Black Lives Matter samstöðufundinum sem var á Austurvelli fyrir nokkrum vikum. En Jeffrey ætlar að tala á ensku. Þannig að við gefum Jeffrey orðið.
Thank you. Don't clap until you hear what I have to say. Yeah, my name is Jeff Guarino, and moved to Iceland in 2002, shortly after September 11th, with my Icelandic wife and my young son. I didn't expect to find myself in Iceland, but after September 11th, there was a noticeable shift in the United States that was disturbing to me and my wife. We left the summer after that. My wife worked, it's just curious, I figure you might be interested. My wife, who's Icelandic, worked in the hospital systems in the United States. And during the attack, which, as you can see, I'm a chef, and I worked at a franchising McDonald's. I remember that day well. I was off, and watching the news was kind of surreal because I had just woken up. My wife had gone to work, and there were sirens going off all over my city, which is disturbing in and of itself because it's normally noisy, but it was especially noisy that day. Anyway, I had called her. She was on the road and was almost in a panic because the hospital had told her to come back to the hospital. They were expecting a ton of casualties. The FBI was locking down streets. They were closing schools. There was a level of panic that I kind of never expected in the United States, which is strange. I myself, at 17, I enlisted in the United States Navy. So you're talking to someone who was pretty much indoctrinated to the American way of life, an American ideal. So being July the 4th, which we're going to talk about my experience after being African American, and even that sounds weird to me because I don't know anything about Africa, really. I just consider myself American. It's the only thing I know. And the terms that go through what black people call themselves is very funny because my grandmother used to call black people jimmies, which is the chocolate sprinkles you put on ice cream. So it always struck me funny, like we don't have really names or transit, they keep changing, but whatever. So as I grew up, I didn't know anything. And as I got older, I became curious. One of the things I really loved when I came to Iceland was this sense of family, deep ties, sense of history, pride. That I had pride in being an American, but I didn't really know much at the time. But I came to learn some really interesting things. And one of the things I learned was that the more things change, the more they stay the same. So I was very proud that the first person to die in the American Revolution was an African American. He was actually what they call a mulatto. He was mixed. He had an African father and a Native American mother. And he was, if I'm not mistaken, was a sailor. He made knots. His name was Crispus Attucks. And his death followed what was later to be called the Boston Massacre. There's some really interesting and curious things about that whole story in that it said that there was a little tension because the British were occupying the states and they were actually taking jobs, these little part-time jobs, away from sailors on the East Coast. And there was tension because of that. There was an economic thing going on, as we all, I don't know if you know how much history you know, but So they were kind of annoyed with the British being there. Well, there was an argument and a fight that took place, and they say that Crispus approached one of the soldiers, and they shot into the crowd, killing 5 people, one of them being Crispus Attucks. What's interesting is I immediately thought about all these police shootings you hear about in the States. Police shootings that you hear about in the States. And what is written of the trial that later took place, which one of the lawyers was, I believe, John Adams, the second United States president, in describing Crispus, said that, no, I got to get the quote because this kind of blew me away. It says that Crispus Attucks, John Adams serving as lawyer for the Crown, revealed that the mad behavior of Attucks, whose very looks was enough to terrify any person. That's what John Adams said about Crispus. I'm thinking, you know, how many times I've heard that from police officers? I was afraid for my life. You know, it's like these guys had muskets. Okay, they're muskets, but the crowd was unarmed. So I found that very interesting that he used that to describe, because it's what they say today. Police, when they justify killing a civilian, say, I was afraid for my life. They're like, okay, you were afraid. Yes, Adams became the second American president. And pretty interesting, he was serving the Crown, but whatever. The officers who fired on the crowd were later acquitted, which really disturbed the public, which sounds like today. It's so strange. So the beginning of the American Revolution is what's still happening today. It's really insane to think about. So war broke out in the spring of 1775. There were a number of black men, both slave and free, who served. As a matter of fact, it's written in the record, and a lot of this information I got from PBS and also West Point War College. So black men, both slave and free, which means even though they were slaves, they were fighting for a country that had them enslaved, which, okay. But they saw something in the United States. It's that, you know, that land of the free, home of the brave. It's okay. If you believe that, then we'll fight for you. Well, they served bravely at Lexington and Concord and the famous Battle of Bunker Hill. According to documents archived, former slave named Salem Poor performed so heroically at Bunker Hill. Exactly what he had done had been lost to history, but that 14 officers, and at that time, of course, they were white, because there were no black officers. So 14 white officers wrote to the Massachusetts legislature commending him as brave and gallant soldier who deserved a reward. Valor like this wasn't enough, however, and shortly after his appointment as commander-in-chief, George Washington signed an order forbidding the recruitment of all blacks. Forbidding. So our first president, even after this battle for independence took place, and blacks, both free and slave, had fought, one of them so valiantly that the white officers recommended he get a reward for his gallantry, was rewarded by Washington saying, we don't want any blacks serving in the military. Okay, this blows my mind. So when I grew up, I knew of Crispus. That's a strange name, but I knew of him and I heard of him and I was proud of that fact. It made me feel like I belonged. And one of the things African Americans are seeking is to belong. It's something a lot of people take for granted. If you're Icelandic and you're in Iceland, that's one of the things I love about Iceland. It's like, you don't think about it. It's not something to think about. When I grew up, I knew that Africans were enslaved and blah, blah. So where did I come from? Well, what is my roots? I don't have any. My roots only start in the United States. So my only investment is in the United States. So when people say things like, why don't you go back to Africa? Yeah, and do what? And then Africa is so diverse in and of itself. There are people here from Ghana and Nigeria, and they're all different. And it's just, I just find that statement so mindless. So to belong, African Americans have fought in every war from the time of its founding. And it wasn't until 1960 that they got the right to vote. So if you let that sink in to anyone who says, why don't they just pick up their bootstraps? Why are they always complaining? Okay, so from 1775 till 1960, they couldn't even vote. What does not having the right to vote or a say in your destiny mean to a person? Now, after the Civil War, Lincoln had promised 40 acres and a mule to everyone who fought. Now, when he was assassinated, that died with him. And 40 acres and a mule, I mean, they were giving land, vast tracts of land to others, and blacks were excluded. So even after slavery, they were left with nothing, so they practically had to go back to slavery. You don't have any land. And as we all know, as adults, land is power. And especially in Iceland, you know that. Land is power. You own that land. Everybody wants to claim that land, right? So again, July the 4th. Now, the information and knowledge that I have, and I'm speaking to you now, I didn't learn until I was 30. So why did it take so long for me to even know this about my own history and my own people? Because we don't have an education system. We have an indoctrination system. Because if it's an education, then all knowledge is valuable. All knowledge is valuable. Not this is excluded. When I remember a reading of Christopher Columbus, they got these big names in my education that are etched into my brain forever. Washington, Columbus. And then I heard of Leif Erikson. And I said, gee, he was there before Columbus? Columbus was this great navigator, and he missed India. So why are we celebrating this guy? Why don't I know more about Leif Erikson, who was there before? Why is that not well known? And why don't I wanted to know more about that. It's like, well, he was there before, so Christopher Columbus didn't discover anything. As a matter of fact, he got the people's name wrong, call them Indians. All right, so, you know, as you get older, you start questioning things. It's the nature of when you're kids. You really shouldn't stop. We always question, and that sense of wonder had always been instilled in me. And mostly because I am African American, and I had to search out my roots. I had friends who were Irish American and Italian American and very proud, and they can tell me, this part of Italy, my family's from here. As a matter of fact, the southern half of Italy, if your name ends in O, you're from this part of Italy. I thought that was great. That was crazy. That was cool. We eat pasta with tomato sauce. We eat pasta with olive oil. I mean, that was just so amazing to me. But when I thought of myself, I'm like, well, my grandmother makes fried chicken. I don't know where she learned it. I don't know how that came about, but that's what she does. And that was, 1960, 1950, whatever. There are some African Americans who do know their history that goes way back. And the history in the United States is so entangled, but those who control knowledge control perception. There are a lot of white people in the United States who are actually black, if technically, because they say if you have a drop of black blood, you're black. I don't get that. It's really weird. But African Americans come in all kinds of shades. And what really amazed me is that there are blue-eyed Africans, there are African Americans with blonde hair, and I said, well, gee, what happened? Well, we all know, come on, we're adults. When you go on vacation and you're single, things might happen. So, you know, there was some mixing going on. And in the 1920s, 30s, and even earlier, for instance, we know Jefferson had an affair with his mistress, his slave, which I won't say mistress. Technically, she was raped, but I was trying to be nice. And that's the other thing, you know. Truth is truth. I'm also a religious man. And what that means is that any religion really focuses you to focus on yourself. Before you decide you're going to go change the world, did you change yourself? That's the renewing of your mind. But that's another thing. But what that informs me is that we all have to look inside ourselves for what is true. And sometimes it's not pretty. Like, you know, I used to eat what I wanted to eat when I was young, but I got a thing going on here. And so I had to change the way I thought about things. I had to change my relation to food and things, you know. And I might have to change, get a little more exercise, get to the gym. As a matter of fact, you know, Iceland is kind of that place. I see people running, jogging. I'm like, I'll be there in a minute. Just, yeah, I need to get out there, you know. But you got to change. Change is inevitable, right? But, all right, I get off track. But, so my education, I realized, was really an indoctrination. Because the things that I was curious about, I wasn't really getting any information on. The women's rights movement, which kind of blew me away, that women were property as much as slaves earlier in the early part of the American experience. And the way they dealt with women was similar in a lot of ways, which kind of blew me away, because I didn't think about it. I never thought about it. But as we learned about the civil rights movement, we go back and we learn other movements that came before that. And we keep seeing these struggles against what? And it was an idea. Well, what was the idea? The idea was a sort of supremacy, a male, white, European dominant supremacy. So I said to myself, you know, I know a lot of white males who don't have that in them. Don't, you know, when you say you don't see color, that's not the exact correct thing to say, whatever. I get it, though. My friends were from the Philippines, South Korea, had some friends from Vietnam. And the one thing that I remember growing up was we didn't really, it wasn't a thing. It was like a great thing to have friends from different places. I used to go to my friend's house. Mother used to make these weird noodle soups for me. Another friend used to make these little other dough things filled with meat. And I thought that was great. I thought it was great to get all these different, you know, experiences. It wasn't something to be afraid of or scared of. Or what. I embraced it, and I loved it. And like I said, for myself, there's only a little bit I can give of what my background was. African-American experiences, the blues and Southern food. Jazz was a uniquely American invention, these things. So the collective idea of what it is to be an American, I just took it, I was American. I was American. But I was a curious one. So back to this dominant supremacy. So I had to come up with this thing, like, I heard the term human race, and I heard races. There's different races, but there's a human race. Well, all right, so wait. All right, the human race covers everything, but there's different races. But then I thought about it, I said, gee, that sounds like speciation. That sounds like different species. Mm-hmm. You're of a different race. That, you just listen to that. It just kind of makes you think, oh, what, do they eat something different? What? Do they not go to the bathroom the same way? They're a different race. Then I looked that up. And I can't exactly remember the name of the guy because it kind of blew me away, the information that I came across, which was an older white European scientist, I think of French origin, I'm not sure. But basically came up with the classification was not scientific at all. It was just kind of his personal opinion and observation. And scientists today have said there's really no difference in that kind of classification. It's not a thing. But we all use it, and even I use it, and I hate using it because when you say the human race, it makes me your brother. It makes me your, you know, it makes me a part and concerned for your welfare as well as mine. We all breathe the same air. It's one of the things I loved about John F. Kennedy. And you ever notice that all the peacemakers get shot in the head? We should all live together. Kill them. Why is that? Well, you got to go deep. You go deeper and you start finding things. So this idea was, in the Americas, I just read to you about Crispus, and he was working alongside whites and everything. There was a thing when he was murdered and they were going to bury him, that they did have segregated cemeteries, but they made an exception for him. That was kind of cool, but okay. They made an exception for him, but he was among them. He was drinking in the bar with them. I found that really interesting in that time. Like, people who were working class, the kind of things that they did together, they were together. You know, there was freed and slaves and, you know, they're working sailors, black, white. They're just in there drinking and the British a-holes, you know. So, like, where did this division come in? Well, I remember in a Roman thing about divide and conquer, right? If you look at the founding fathers, they were very against national banks, for instance. I didn't know that. You read up on that. It's pretty interesting. And the power and influence of that and why they were against centralized banking. So the power structure was when the colonists came to the United States and were farming, they said the crown wanted riches. They wanted gold. They wanted silver. There wasn't no gold. There wasn't that much silver in the area on the East Coast. So they said, you know what? We need agriculture, fine, crops, tobacco, these very hard crops to farm. So they tried to enslave the local population, the Native Americans, who, knowing their own land, they would run away and they would know how to fight back. They would, you know, and also they were susceptible to European diseases. So the white settlers, who I don't believe, you know, really had that kind of supremacist idea, whatever, but they were put upon to perform. You know, you're there and you owe us, the crown is saying. We got to get labor to farm this land. So this hence becomes slavery being what it was, chattel slavery. This is economic. This is economic. It seems strange to import a whole bunch of people from another continent to do all your farming, but that's another thing. They couldn't do it with the native population. That's the only thing. That's what I do know. So again, the idea of independence. African Americans have been fighting for it forever. It seems to be forever. 1960s, come on. That's when the civil rights. We're talking civil rights. Civil, just to be civil. Is that really hard to be civil? And then you have equal rights. You got people who say, nah, I don't think everybody should have equal rights. Look, we're all here on this planet for a short period of time. Do you really want to be the one to deny somebody their full breadth of life? The United States, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So those are the things I clung to. At 17 years old, again, this comes down to economics in a way. Half of my class, 1,400 kids, graduated high school, 17 years old. What are you going to do? Well, if your parents had enough money, they sent you to college. If they didn't have enough money, you went into the military. Why did you go into the military? Because you wanted to? Because you wanted to fight? Because you really, no, you wanted money to go to school. Your parents, that was the thing. That's kind of the indoctrination. You graduate, you go to college, get your degree, you get a job, get married, have babies die. That's kind of the thing, okay? So I went into the military at 17 years old, knowing crap, never gone from my hometown, never left from my hometown. I go to Orlando, Florida, and I'm thrown on Ronald base. Ronald Reagan, or I think it was George Bush, was president at the time. And this was right before the first Gulf War. And I'm surrounded by kids who are my age from all over the country. I'd never been all over the country, but there were kids from Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, Ohio, Illinois, Georgia, all over. The one thing we all had in common, we all came from working class families, and many were even poorer. So we had a lot in common, and we got along great. And I'll never forget, one of my CEOs said, civilians are crap, okay? He said, don't ever trust a civilian. They don't believe in anything, they'll stab you in the back. He says, but here, it's different. And that struck me, that he said that. I just found that really strange. And he says, I don't care if you're black, white, male, female. He says, that doesn't matter here. He says, because if you're on a battlefield, you really don't give a crap what somebody's religion is when they got a gun behind you or there's a gun facing you. And I found that very profound. And we trained together, and we ended up in a ball of these grown young men crying, singing a song that was Proud to Be an American by Lee Greenwood. Black, white, we were all together. After that, we were brothers. There was no separating us. If you went for one, you'd go for all. That was to be a part of something, okay? Again, belonging, to belong, to belong. It's a very powerful motivator. If I belong here, then I'm invested here. Then I have a responsibility here. But if I do not belong, I don't care if it burns down. And that's what you see in the United States right now. Rioting and looting. They don't own anything. What do they care? They don't feel invested. So July the 4th, what does that mean? To an African American, might mean little. What means more would be the celebration called Juneteenth. Juneteenth was a celebration of emancipation. It was 2 months after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered in Virginia to the Union General Gordon Granger, that put into effect the Emancipation Proclamation, which was issued 2.5 years earlier by Abraham Lincoln. That celebration was huge. It was celebrated in town squares, parks, and everything, until the Southerners, who felt naturally rejected and, despondent, couldn't stand to see African Americans jumping around celebrating their defeat, basically. The fact that they no longer could own them as slaves, that these were free people. So through legislation and through, through legislation and through violent acts, really, they stopped those celebrations. So those celebrations became a kind of thing that African Americans would celebrate in their own homes and whatnot. It's strange how, I'm 50 years old and sort of always kind of got this message that African Americans are naturally criminal and violent. And when I look through history, that's not what I find. I find them victims. The song Strange Fruit, I didn't know what that song meant until I looked it up. There were picnics with African Americans hanging from trees. Now, to wrap your head around being African American in America, you have to understand that was 1950s and 1940s. That was the lifetime of most people's grandparents. It wasn't that long ago, where the pharmacist, the doctor, your neighbor, the guy who bags your groceries is in a picnic, there's pictures, on a square with his children while a black African American person is hanging in a tree. This was like a kind of celebration, a party of some sort. It's kind of macabre. It's macabre. I mean, see, this is when you say Black Lives Matter. I'm not saying better. It just matters. Just matters. Matters. Michael Che. Black lives simply matters. Now, somebody said to me, but all lives matter. It's like, yeah, that's natural. And another person said to me, they put an article about the Irish-American experience, which is very interesting because the Irish and the Italians weren't considered white in most of the history of the United States, which blew my mind. What was that? You should have, I mean, some of the stuff I read about how they described Italians as dogs, you know? It's like, wow, man. I mean, that's crazy to me. But you see, this thing is fluid. It doesn't make sense. But she said, Irish lives matter. And you know what I said? Of course they do. But if you say Black lives matter, what do you mean Black lives matter? All lives matter. It's like I don't understand that response. And that response tells me you've been indoctrinated. You've been indoctrinated because there's no reason for that response. If somebody says to me, you know, Danish lives matter. Yeah, well, of course. Some people might disagree, but Danish lives matter. You know, yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, of course. It's not a big deal. Yes, okay. And once you get past that, it's easy. It's like, you know, you're in a walk in a park. It's that resistance that is weird. That resistance. A lot of this stuff comes out of economics. Who really controls the purse strings? Who's in charge? And it seems to me in the United States, when 9/11 happened, go back to 9/11, my reason for my exodus, well, actually my wife, because, you know, I can argue with her. And I did argue with her for a little bit, but she won. So, and I'm glad she won, to tell you the truth. I am glad she won. And I want to say this right now, to be clear. I absolutely love Iceland. Love Iceland. You know why? I've never been followed by the police. I've never had someone call the police on me for walking down the street. I've never had someone just say something nasty to me just walking down. All those things happen to me in the States. All those things. And I was born there. I even served in the military. It's a very strange feeling to be able to walk and be free, to be just seen as me. Now, I know everybody, there's different people and everybody sees things different, but basically we're all the same. There's nothing that I want that you don't want. There's nothing, I get the thing in my head, what do people believe? The people who don't like black people, what do they think? Like, I wake up and I'm like, what am I going to do? I'm going to bust into that window. I'm going to beat up that person. What? I mean, like, really? Is that what? I don't really, that's not a fun day to me. I just don't know. And I've been around so many different kinds of people. I always see the same things. I grew up in a middle-class neighborhood with immigrants, and they didn't give a crap that I was African-American. Didn't really, whatever. Do you work? Yeah, I work. Do you pay your taxes? Yeah, I pay my taxes. Have you committed any crime lately? No, I haven't committed any crime. Well, fine. Sit down and eat something. You know, I mean, they really didn't care, you know. Most of my best experience comes from, and I hate saying white, but white people have given me jobs, have taken me into their homes. I've been, you know, accepted into families. You know, my best friend who's Italian-American, my own stepfather who's Italian-American. They just, do you work? Are you common sense? Do you have common sense? Because if you don't have common sense, then I don't want to deal with you. I don't care if you're black, white, Mexican, blue, purple. If you can't have common sense, I'm not talking to you. And I respected that. I respected that. And that's all it was. That's how I grew up. So I never saw people as something to be afraid of or something to be against. I was raised by my mother, African-American woman. My mother, who raised 3 boys on welfare, her one ambition for me was to graduate school without getting anyone pregnant. She didn't want to be a grandmother before her time, which I did. And so, I mean, and that was like all my friends. We all had that same experience, same commonality. And that's what it meant for me to be American. And then it's changed. Again, September 11th brought a fear I'd never seen in my country before. I always knew Americans, for the most part, weren't the smartest bunch, because they had no curiosity outside of the borders of the United States. But when I talked to my friends who had family in other parts of the world, they were curious, and they knew more about world events and what was going on. And they knew the difference between Iceland and Greenland. No, I'm not kidding. When I moved here, they were like, they got power out there? They thought I was going to like the Alaskan wilderness or something. They got igloos. I believe there's igloos. No, there's no igloos there. Like, what, did you see penguins? No, penguins are on the South Pole. That's where they are. And for my own benefit, I mean, I was into National Geographic and everything, so I knew a little more than they did. And when I came to Iceland, I said, where are the grass-covered houses that I saw? And then nationally, I see the buildings. And why isn't all the women wearing the costume? I thought they all wore the costume 24/7. I thought that's what was happening. And there's no horns. I didn't see the horns. And the singing, they were opera stars from what I thought. So, I mean, I had to educate myself. And I come to respect Iceland and the people here. And the people here that I've met, young and old, just work. They do what they're supposed to do. They don't bother anyone. You know, it's kind of like how I grew up. Just common sense. Just, you know, take care of your own thing, whatever. You know, fatteretest. You know, and I'm like, yeah, okay, yeah, cool. But the American experience had changed in the last few years, and it's gone as we see now with Donald Trump. And I understand Donald Trump. I understand why he is president, because the system has kind of idolized that wealth, idolized that idea. I always found that really sickening because, like I said, common sense. I remember when the presidential race with McCain and Obama, and they asked McCain, they said, how many houses do you have? And he said, I have 10. How do you live in 10 houses? Well, how much is enough? Now, that's another question, but that's why Trump is up there, because people kind of see, I can be him. Why would you want to be him? But I could be him. Why would you want to be him? Because that's what we were brought up to. That's the goal. How many toys? I grew up in a religious household, Roman Catholic, and my father was Jehovah's Witness. And what it meant for me was a variety of ideas. And I was free enough to choose. I was free enough to choose what I believed. And then I was challenged on what I believed. And I stood most every challenge. And if I was wrong, I was happy to be corrected, because I didn't want to be ignorant. But then you look at Trump, and you're like, what? I mean, for kids growing up in the States, like, you could be president. They say that. And for African-American kids, that was really big. It's like, you could be president one day. And it was a desperate hope for African-American parents to say that to the children, because they knew and feared that they wouldn't. And so if you look at the pictures when Obama was elected, it was a weird spiritual, it broke something good that was in African Americans' hearts. That you don't have to be African American to vote for somebody who you think can do the job. See, that's what we've been getting to the whole point, the whole time. Because we believed every war the United States has fought, African Americans stood up. In World War II, coming home, GIs, black GIs, African American GIs, would get on the bus and have to sit in back of the bus while German soldiers who killed American soldiers sat in front of them. What do you think that does to a person's mental health? And on the top of mental health, if you see something wrong in the African American psyche, why do you think that would be? After 400 years of slavery, of being told you're less, you're 3/4 of a human, of watching your mother, father, sister, everybody be ripped away from you, tortured, killed. In New York City, they excavated a site, and they found the graves of a bunch of children. And they excavated an adult male. What was interesting is that his muscles had been so overworked that they detached themselves from the bone. So, and we're told that we're lazy? All right. So, what does it mean? What does this independence mean? It means if African Americans fight under the yoke of slavery to be free, then it's a natural desire within every man and every woman to be free. Free. Just don't let me do what I'm going to do. Why are you bothering me? This is just human right. As I stand here today, and as I reflect on all that I've learned and all that I think I want to continue to learn, I'm learning more about Iceland's independence and why that is. And it's just interesting to me. It's like everybody wants their freaking independence. Okay? We're here. You're there. Don't tell me what to do. Kind of attitude. It's like, that's so human. But there's that resistance. Who's resisting? Those that want to keep a certain population under their foot. For what? To make themselves feel like something? I don't know. I really don't know. Never understood monarchy either. But that's another thing. So, I love the idea of America. But as times progress, I'm wondering, they're going through growing pains. No change happens without some pain. Women who have children know this. We all kind of know this. You want to change your body, you're going to go through some pain. It's not going to be easy. That's why I avoid the gym. But anyway, you know, that's the thing you got to get over your head. If you're going to change for the better, it goes to some pain, you know, whether it's emotional or psychological. And I'm proud of the Americans that are there because I know they're good people. Just like most people I've met in my life. They're just decent people. They don't really want to get into your business. They want to live. They want to go have a good time, drink a beer with their friends. Go to work, feel good about doing something productive. That's being human. That's why it's called the human race. It's simple. You know, somebody wants to express their individuality. They have a short period of life. Why would you want to squash that? You know, JFK, one of my favorite presidents, who wanted to abolish the federal bank because he thought it was ridiculous for the United States to pay a private bank to make the money for the United States. He's dead. But also said, you know, we all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. And we are all mortal. Dead. Martin Luther King, he wanted to be judged by the content of his character. So this is what, for me, I hang on to when I think of July the 4th. Independence. The importance of human beings to express that. Their independence. And I hope that the United States finds its way, and I hope that we all are able to find our own way to be who we want to be with what time we have. Thank you.